The glob of saliva mixed with the institutional gravy like poison in a well. Mike Tyson stared down at his tray, watching the wetness spread across the pale mound of potatoes. His massive hands, scarred from decades of combat, remained perfectly still on either side of the aluminum rectangle. 20 years of anger management, 20 years of meditation, 20 years of telling himself he was a different man. All of it evaporated in the span of a heartbeat. Carlos Mendez stood behind him, close enough that Mike could smell the cheap tobacco on his breath and the hair gel that barely contained his slicked-back ponytail. The Latino's prison-buffed frame cast a shadow across Mike's table, and when he spoke, his voice carried just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Oops," Carlos said, not bothering to hide his smirk. "Clumsy me." The silence in the chow hall stretched like a taut wire. Forks hung suspended halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their clattering behind the serving line. 300 pairs of eyes watched the back of Mike Tyson's graying head, waiting to see if the legend still had teeth. Mike lifted his gaze slowly, and Carlos saw something flicker behind those dark eyes that made his smirk falter. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been normal, expected. This was colder, older, like looking into the eyes of a shark that had been sleeping on the ocean floor and suddenly decided it was hungry. "You know," Mike said, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying across the dead quiet hall, "I haven't hurt anybody in a long time." Carlos felt his confidence waver but pressed forward. This was his moment, his chance to prove to the hermano sangre that he could handle the prison's most notorious resident. "Yeah? Well, maybe it's time you remembered what happens when you get soft, old man." Mike stood up. The movement was fluid, predatory, like a python uncoiling. At 57, he still carried 220 pounds of muscle and fury, and when he turned to face Carlos, the younger man suddenly understood why crowds used to scream when Iron Mike entered the ring. "Soft?" Mike repeated, and something in his tone made the guards at the perimeter reach for their radios. "You think I'm soft?" The first blow came faster than anyone watching could track. Mike's left hand shot out like a piston, catching Carlos in the solar plexus with surgical precision. No wild haymaker, no telegraphed right cross, just a short, devastating shot that folded the gang leader in half and sent him crashing into the nearest table. Trays exploded across the floor. Inmates scattered. Someone screamed. Carlos tried to stand, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and Mike was on him again. This time it was a right hand to the body, delivered with the same mechanical efficiency that had once made him the most feared fighter on the planet. The sound echoed through the chow hall like a gunshot. "Stop," Carlos wheezed, but Mike wasn't listening anymore. The careful meditation, the anger management classes, the years of therapy, all of it had been stripped away, revealing something primal underneath, something that recognized disrespect and answered it with violence. The third punch never landed. Mike's fist stopped 6 inches from Carlos's face, trembling with barely contained power. For a moment that seemed to last forever, the two men stared at each other. Predator and prey, legend and pretender, killer and victim. Then Mike stepped back. "I'm soft," he said, his voice carrying an edge that made even the guards nervous. "But I'm not dead." By now, the cavalry had arrived. 6 guards in riot gear swarmed the chow hall, tasers drawn, shouting commands that nobody really heard. But Mike had already returned to his seat, staring down at his ruined meal with the same expression he'd worn before Carlos's spit had changed everything. Carlos remained on the floor, clutching his ribs and trying not to vomit. He'd gotten his answer about Mike Tyson's transformation, just not the one he'd expected. The old boxer wasn't soft, he was controlled, which somehow made him more terrifying than ever. As the guards zip-tied Mike's hands behind his back and prepared to escort him to solitary, he turned back to look at Carlos one final time. What he saw in the young man's face wasn't just pain or fear, it was something else, something familiar, recognition. Carlos wasn't looking at him like a gang leader who'd just been beaten down by a legend. He was looking at him like someone who'd been waiting 20 years for this exact moment. Like someone who'd been planning this encounter since he was old enough to understand what revenge meant. Mike felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the prison's air conditioning. As they led him away from the wreckage of the chow hall, One thought echoed through his mind with crystalline clarity. This wasn't random. This was personal. And if Carlos Mendez knew something about Mike's past, really knew something, then 20 years of carefully constructed peace was about to come crashing down around them all. The walk to solitary confinement measured exactly 147 steps. Mike had counted them on his first trip down this corridor 3 years ago, and the number had become a meditation of sorts. Today, each footfall echoed like a gunshot in his skull, drowning out the guards' radio chatter and the distant sounds of the prison returning to its normal rhythm. The zip tie bit into his wrists, but Mike barely felt it. His mind was racing backward through 20 years of carefully buried memories, searching for any connection to Carlos Mendez. That look, that moment of recognition, it meant something. It meant everything. "Cell block H7, announced Officer Martinez, a decent man who'd never treated Mike like a circus attraction. 72 hours, pending investigation. The steel door clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid, and Mike was alone with his thoughts. The solitary cell smelled of disinfectant and desperation. A concrete box barely large enough to contain his frame. A thin mattress, a steel toilet, and a slot for food trays comprised his entire world for the next 3 days. He'd been here before, a few times in his early years when the adjustment to prison life had been rough. But this time felt different. This time the walls seemed to press closer with each breath. Mike sat on the narrow bunk and let his head fall back against the cold concrete. His knuckles throbbed, muscle memory from a lifetime of violence reasserting itself. He flexed his fingers slowly, watching the scarred skin stretch across bones that had broken jaws and ribs and dreams. 20 years since Manila. 20 years since Diego. The name hit him like a physical blow, and Mike's breathing grew shallow. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to push the memories back into their carefully constructed prison. But Carlos's face kept intruding. Those eyes, that bone structure. Something familiar in the set of his jaw, the way his lips had curved into that smirk. Family resemblance runs deep, Mike thought, and the observation sent ice through his veins. Outside his cell, the prison hummed with its usual rhythms. Shift changes, count time, the eternal shuffle of men serving their time while trying to hold on to whatever pieces of themselves remained intact. Mike had spent years learning these rhythms, finding peace in their predictability. He'd built a quiet life here, correspondence courses, a job in the library, weekly calls with his daughter. Exodus. 28 years old now, a social worker in Detroit with her mother's gentle heart and her father's stubborn streak. She visited when she could, driving 8 hours each way to sit across from him in the visiting room and pretend they were just a normal father and daughter catching up. Those visits were the anchor that kept him sane, the reminder that somewhere beyond these walls he was more than just inmate 78,432. The thought of losing those visits, of Exodus learning about Manila, about what really happened to Diego Mendez in that sweltering gym, made Mike's chest tighten with panic. She knew about his conviction, of course, assault charges from a bar fight gone wrong, or at least that's what the official record stated. But she didn't know about the sparring partner who died under mysterious circumstances 2 decades ago. She didn't know about the cover-up, the payoffs, the way the boxing commission had made the problem disappear. She didn't know her father was a killer. Mike pulled out the photograph he kept tucked behind his thin pillow. Exodus at her college graduation, cap slightly askew, arms wrapped around his shoulders during a rare moment when the visiting room cameras weren't watching. Her smile was radiant, proud, untainted by the knowledge of what he'd done in his darkest moments. "I won't lose you," he whispered to the photograph. "Not again, not ever." But even as he spoke the words, doubt gnawed at him. If Carlos was who Mike suspected he was, if that familiar face belonged to Diego's younger brother, then this was about more than prison politics or gang posturing. This was about justice deferred, about a debt that had been accumulating interest for 20 years. The food slot scraped open, startling Mike from his thoughts. Officer Martinez's weathered face appeared in the opening. "Your lawyer called," Martinez said quietly. "Wants to schedule a visit tomorrow. Also got a message from your daughter. Says she loves you and hopes you're staying out of trouble." He paused, studying Mike's expression. Might want to take that advice to heart, Tyson. Whatever happened in that chow hall today, it felt bigger than the usual bullshit. The slot closed, leaving Mike alone again with the photograph and his fears. Staying out of trouble. If only it were that simple. If only Carlos Mendez was just another gang leader testing his reputation instead of a ghost from a past Mike had spent decades trying to forget. Outside his cell, Dannemora settled into its evening rhythm. But Mike knew that somewhere in the general population, Carlos was recovering from their encounter and planning his next move. The recognition in those eyes had been too specific, too personal to ignore. The war for Mike Tyson's soul was just beginning. Inciting incident. Mike didn't sleep. He lay on the thin mattress listening to the symphony of institutional sounds, distant footsteps, the hum of fluorescent lights, the occasional clang of metal on metal that marked the passage of time in places like this. His eyes remained fixed on the concrete ceiling, tracking hairline cracks he'd memorized during previous stays in solitary. At 3:17 a.m., the food slot opened again. This time it wasn't Officer Martinez. The face that appeared belonged to someone Mike didn't recognize, a young guard with nervous eyes and sweaty palms. He glanced left and right before sliding something through the opening that definitely wasn't a food tray. "Someone paid me to make sure you got this," the guard whispered. "Said to tell you it was time you knew the truth." The envelope hit the concrete floor with a soft thud. By the time Mike sat up, the slot had already closed, leaving him alone with whatever message had been important enough to risk bribing a correctional officer. Mike stared at the envelope for a long moment, every instinct screaming at him not to touch it. Whatever was inside would change everything. He could feel it in his bones, the same way he used to sense when an opponent was about to throw their knockout punch. Some knowledge, once gained, could never be unknown. But curiosity was a hungry beast, and after 20 years of silence, Mike was starving for answers. The envelope wasn't sealed, just folded shut. Inside were 3 items: a yellowed newspaper clipping, a photograph, and a handwritten letter on prison commissary paper. Mike looked at the photograph first. It showed 2 boys, maybe 8 and 12 years old, standing in what appeared to be a boxing gym. The older boy wore gloves that were too big for his hands, his stance awkward but determined. The younger one watched from the sidelines, hero worship clear in his dark eyes. Even across 20 years, and despite the changes that prison and hard living had carved into his features, Mike recognized them both: Diego Mendez and his little brother Carlos. The newspaper clipping was from a Manila sports weekly, dated 3 weeks after Diego's death. The headline read, "Promising boxer's death raises questions." The article was brief, perfunctory, the kind of journalism that resulted when too many important people wanted a story to go away. But there were details that made Mike's blood run cold. Sources close to the investigation suggest that Mendez's death may not have been the accident initially reported. Witnesses describe hearing an argument between Mendez and an unnamed American fighter minutes before the fatal sparring session. The Manila Police Department has declined to comment on whether they are treating this as a homicide investigation. Mike's hands trembled as he reached for the letter. Carlos's handwriting was surprisingly neat, the product of someone who'd spent years perfecting his penmanship during long stretches of incarceration. "Mike, I've been watching you for 3 years, not just here at Dannemora, but before. I made sure I got transferred to this prison specifically so I could be close to you, so I could study you, so I could figure out the best way to make you pay for what you did to my brother. Diego talked about you all the time when we were kids, how you were going to be his ticket out of the barrios, how sparring with Iron Mike Tyson was going to teach him everything he needed to know about boxing. He worshipped you, right up until the moment you killed him. I know it wasn't an accident. I've read the police reports, the witness statements that were buried, the medical examiner's notes that mysteriously disappeared from the official file. I know you hit him after the bell, when his guard was down. I know you left him bleeding on the canvas while you collected your money and flew back to America. Do you want to know how I know all this? Because I was there, Mike, 8 years old, hiding behind the heavy bags where Diego told me to wait while he showed the great Mike Tyson what Filipino heart looked like. I saw everything. For 20 years I've been planning this moment. Getting arrested on purpose so I could learn the prison system. Working my way up in the Hermanos Sangre so I'd have protection and resources when we finally met. learning everything there is to know about you, including the daughter who visits every month and believes her father is a changed man. Today was just the beginning. I wanted you to know that someone remembered Diego. Someone cares that he died alone in that gym while you walked away rich and free. Someone is going to make sure you pay the debt you owe. Your move, champion. Got Carlos. The letter slipped from Mike's fingers, floating to the concrete floor like a death sentence. 20 years of carefully constructed peace crumbled in the span of a few paragraphs. All his meditation, his anger management, his desperate attempts at redemption, none of it mattered. The past had found him at last. Mike pressed his face into his hands, feeling something crack deep inside his chest. Not his ribs or his sternum, but something more fundamental. The story he'd been telling himself for 2 decades, that Diego's death was an accident, that he'd been defending himself from an overeager sparring partner, lay in ruins. Carlos had been there. Carlos had seen everything. And now Carlos was going to destroy the only thing Mike had left, his daughter's love. Mike remained motionless on the thin mattress until the morning shift change, the letter scattered around him like evidence of a crime he could no longer deny. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the narrow window, casting long shadows across the concrete floor, but he barely noticed. His world had shrunk to the size of Carlos's accusations, each word echoing in his skull like hammer blows. When the breakfast tray arrived, pushed through the slot by the same nervous guard who delivered his doom, Mike didn't move. The powdered eggs congealed into yellow paste while he stared at Diego's photograph, trying to reconcile the eager boy with the man who died under his fists. "Not eating today, Tyson?" Officer Martinez's voice came from beyond the door during the noon check. "That's not like you." Mike forced himself to sit up, to make the appropriate responses that would keep them from calling the psych team. He couldn't afford that kind of attention. Not when Carlos was somewhere in the general population, planning his next move. "Just tired," he called back. "Be fine tomorrow." But he wouldn't be fine tomorrow, or the day after that. The careful balance he'd maintained for 3 years at Dannemora was crumbling, and Mike could feel the old rage stirring in his chest like a hibernating animal sensing spring. By the time they released him from solitary, word had already spread through the prison's invisible network. Mike noticed it immediately, the way conversations stopped when he passed, how even hardened lifers stepped aside to let him through. Fear had a particular smell in places like this, sharp and metallic, and it followed him like cologne. "Heard you put Carlos in the infirmary," said Tommy Ricci, a bookmaker serving 15 for racketeering who'd become Mike's chess partner. They were in the library, surrounded by law books and outdated magazines, but Tommy kept his voice low anyway. "That true?" "Carlos is fine," Mike replied, moving his bishop across the worn board between them. "Just needed to catch his breath." Tommy's laugh came out wrong, forced. "Yeah, well, that's not what people are saying. They're saying you went full Iron Mike on him. Saying you looked like the old days when you used to—" He stopped himself, glancing around nervously. "Look, I don't know what that kid did to set you off, but you might want to watch your back. Hermanos Sangre don't usually let disrespect slide." Mike captured Tommy's queen with steady hands that betrayed nothing of the chaos inside. "What do you know about Carlos? How long has he been here?" 3 years, maybe 4. Came in with a rep already. Word was he ran product for the cartels in Queens before they pinched him. Smart guy, though. Keeps his head down, never causes trouble." Tommy paused, studying Mike's face. "Why? You think this is about more than prison politics?" The question hung between them like smoke. Mike moved another piece, buying time to consider how much truth he could afford to share. Tommy was trustworthy, but trust in prison had its limits. Everyone had leverage they were willing to use when the pressure got high enough. "Maybe," Mike said finally, "or maybe he's just another punk who thought the old man was an easy target." But even as he spoke the words, Mike knew they were lies. Carlos's letter had been too specific, too personal. The photograph of Diego as a child, the details about Exodus's visits, this wasn't opportunistic gang posturing. This was systematic, calculated revenge 20 years in the making. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Carlos had orchestrated everything. The transfer to Dannemora, the confrontation in the chow hall, even the specific nature of the disrespect. Spitting in someone's food was a calculated insult, designed to provoke exactly the response it had gotten. Carlos had been studying him, learning his triggers, waiting for the perfect moment to begin dismantling his carefully constructed life. "You okay, Mike?" Tommy's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Checkmate," Mike said quietly, though he hadn't moved a piece in several minutes. Tommy looked down at the board in confusion, then back at Mike's face. Whatever he saw there made him push back from the table. "Maybe we should call it a day." Mike nodded, but he didn't move from his chair. Around him, the library hummed with its usual afternoon activity, men studying for their GEDs, others working on appeals that would never succeed, a few simply hiding from the heat and violence of the yard. Normal sounds of institutional life. But to Mike, they seemed muffled, distant, as if he were hearing them from underwater. Somewhere in this building, Carlos was recovering from their encounter and preparing for round 2. And Mike had no idea what that would look like, or when it would come. He only knew that the 8-year-old boy hiding behind the heavy bags had grown into a man with nothing left to lose and 20 years of carefully planned vengeance to dispense. The photograph of Diego seemed to burn against his skin where he'd tucked it into his pocket. Evidence of a debt he'd never acknowledged, payment for a crime he'd convinced himself was justified. Now the bill had finally come due. Middle development. Mike's phone privileges came at 2 o'clock every Tuesday and Friday, 15 minutes with the outside world that had sustained him through 3 years of concrete and steel. Today marked the first Tuesday since Carlos's letter, and as Mike approached the bank of institutional phones, his hands felt like they belonged to someone else. He dialed Exodus's number from memory, each digit a prayer that she wouldn't hear the change in his voice. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice filled the receiver. "Daddy, I was hoping you'd call today. I've got news." The warmth in her tone made Mike's throat tighten. 28 years old, and she still called him Daddy with the same enthusiasm she'd had as a little girl, back when he'd been her hero instead of her burden. "What's the news, baby girl?" The endearment came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by sleepless nights and Carlos's accusations. "I got the promotion. Senior caseworker, just like we talked about. They want me to head up the new domestic violence unit." Pride radiated through her voice, cutting deeper than any blade Carlos could have wielded. "Remember when I was 12 and you told me I could save the world if I set my mind to it? Well, maybe I can't save the whole world, but I can save pieces of it." Mike closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the scarred metal of the phone booth. Behind him, other inmates waited their turn for connection to lives they'd damaged or abandoned. He'd always told himself he was different, that his crime was victimless bar fight, that his time here was penance rather than justice. Now Carlos's words echoed in his skull. "I saw everything. Daddy? You still there?" "Yeah, I'm here." Mike forced strength into his voice. "I'm proud of you, X. So damn proud. Is everything okay? You sound—" She paused, and Mike could picture her face, the way she bit her lower lip when she was worried, just like her mother used to do. "Tired? Are you sleeping?" The concern in her voice was a knife between his ribs. This was what Carlos wanted to destroy. Not just Mike's peace, but Exodus's love. The one relationship Mike had managed to protect from the wreckage of his past. "Just some trouble with my cellmate snoring." He lied. "Nothing I can't handle. Maybe you could request a transfer. I read online that prisoners have rights about—" "Exodus." Mike's voice came out sharper than he intended, making her fall silent. He could feel other inmates glancing in his direction, drawn by the edge of desperation creeping into his tone. "I need to tell you something. About why I'm really in here." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Exodus finally spoke, her voice was smaller, younger. "I know about the bar fight, Daddy. We've talked about this. Not the bar fight." Mike's knuckles went white around the receiver. Carlos's letter had infected him like poison, making secrets feel like tumors growing in his chest. "About something that happened before, something I never told you." "Mike Tyson." Officer Rodriguez's voice cut through the phone bank. "Time's up. Next. My time's up, baby girl." The words carried more weight than prison regulations. "But we'll talk soon, okay? I love you." I love you too. But Daddy, what did you? The line went dead. Mike stood frozen with the receiver in his hand until Rodriguez approached, keys jangling like wind chimes. Everything okay, Tyson? You look like somebody died. Somebody did die, Mike thought. 20 years ago in Manila, and his little brother has been planning this conversation ever since. Mike replaced the receiver with mechanical precision. Around him, the prison maintained its afternoon rhythm, the shuffle of feet on polished concrete, the distant clang of cell doors, the low hum of conversations in 3 languages. But underneath it all, Mike could hear something else, the sound of his carefully constructed world beginning to collapse. He made it back to his cell before the shaking started. The photograph of Diego lay on his thin pillow where he'd left it. Accusation and evidence rolled into one faded image. But now Mike saw details he'd missed before. The way 8-year-old Carlos stood slightly behind his older brother, protective even then. The way Diego's gloves hung loose on his small hands, dreams too big for his body. Mike had told himself for 20 years that Diego was different in the ring, older, stronger, more aggressive than the boy in this photograph. He'd constructed an entire narrative about self-defense and accidents, about split-second decisions made in the heat of combat. But Carlos's letter had shattered those lies. I was there, Mike. I saw everything. The weight of that witnessing settled on Mike's chest like concrete. An 8-year-old boy, hidden behind heavy bags, watching his hero brother die under the fists of his idol. 20 years of rage and planning, culminating in a transfer to Dannemora and a carefully orchestrated confrontation. Mike pressed his palms against his temples, feeling the first sharp edges of a headache that had nothing to do with stress and everything to do with karma. Somewhere in this prison, Carlos was waiting, and Mike was running out of moves. Plot twist. Mike sat motionless until the dinner bell rang, then forced himself to stand. Carlos would be in the chow hall, Mike was certain of it. Not because the kid needed food, but because he needed to see Mike's face, to watch the great iron Mike Tyson crumble under the weight of truth. The walk to the dining hall felt like a funeral march. Other inmates gave Mike wide berth, their earlier fear now tinged with curiosity. Word traveled fast in prison, and everyone could sense something bigger brewing beneath the surface of yesterday's confrontation. Mike spotted Carlos immediately, sitting at a corner table with 3 other Hermano Sangre members. His face still bore bruises from their encounter, purple shadows around his left eye that should have been badges of defeat. Instead, Carlos wore them like war paint. Their eyes met across the room, and Carlos smiled, not the arrogant smirk of a gang leader, but something sadder and infinitely more dangerous. The smile of a man who'd already won. Mike collected his tray with steady hands, muscle memory carrying him through the motions while his mind reeled. He could feel the weight of Diego's photograph in his pocket like a burning coal, Carlos's letter like a noose around his neck. Every step toward his usual table felt like walking toward his execution. Mike! Tommy Ricci waved him over, but Mike barely heard him. The cafeteria noise, hundreds of conversations, the clatter of plastic trays, the guards' radios, faded to white static as Carlos stood up from his table. The kid walked straight toward him, ignoring the nervous glances from other inmates who sensed violence in the air. Mike's body tensed automatically, hands shifting into fighting position, but Carlos stopped just outside arm's reach. "I hear you tried calling your daughter today," Carlos said quietly, his voice carrying despite the surrounding chaos. "Did you tell her about Manila?" The question hit Mike like a physical blow. "How did you—" "Officer Rodriguez is my cousin," Carlos continued, his smile never wavering. "Third cousin on my mother's side. Amazing what family will do for each other, isn't it? He's been keeping me informed about your calls for months. Every conversation, every "I love you, baby girl," every lie you tell her about who you really are." Mike's vision tunneled, the edges going dark. The cafeteria, the guards, the hundreds of watching inmates, everything collapsed to just Carlos's face and the words pouring from his mouth like acid. "Did you know she researches domestic violence cases?" Carlos asked conversationally. "Spent her whole career helping families destroyed by violent men. Funny how life works out, don't you think? The daughter of a killer, dedicating herself to protecting people from monsters like you." "She's not part of this," Mike managed, his voice barely recognizable. She's been part of this since the moment you murdered my brother. Carlos stepped closer, close enough that Mike could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, eyes that looked exactly like Diego's in that faded photograph. Everything you think you know about that night is wrong, Mike. You want to know what really happened in Manila? Mike's world tilted sideways. I know what happened. I was there. You were drunk, Carlos said simply. Tequila and cocaine, according to the toxicology report that mysteriously disappeared from the official file. Diego wasn't some eager challenger looking to prove himself. He was trying to help you train for the Morrison fight, doing exactly what your people paid him to do, give you light work to shake off the rust. The words hit Mike like sledgehammers. That's not, I remember. You remember what 20 years of guilt let you remember, Carlos continued remorselessly. Selective memory is a beautiful thing, isn't it? Lets you sleep at night, lets you play the loving father to a daughter who'd vomit if she knew the truth. Mike's hands began to shake. Around them, the cafeteria had gone unnaturally quiet, hundreds of inmates sensing the invisible violence crackling between the two men. Diego never fought back, Carlos whispered, his voice cutting through Mike's defenses like a scalpel. Never raised his hands, never threw a punch, just kept trying to cover up while you beat him to death. You want to know what his last words were? Tell Carlos I'm sorry. Sorry he couldn't come home to help take care of our mother. Sorry he believed the great Mike Tyson was someone worth admiring. The truth hit Mike like a freight train, 20 years of carefully constructed lies exploding in his chest. He remembered now, not the sanitized version he'd fed himself for decades, but the real memory. Diego on the canvas, blood pooling beneath his head, while Mike stood over him screaming about disrespect and weakness. The kid had been trying to apologize, trying to explain that he was just following instructions, but Mike had been too far gone to hear anything but his own rage. I was 8 years old, Carlos said, his voice finally cracking with emotion, hiding behind those heavy bags, watching my hero brother die while his idol collected $20,000 and flew home to America. Mike's knees buckled. The great iron Mike Tyson, heavyweight champion of the world, destroyer of men, reduced to nothing by the simple truth he'd spent 20 years running from. Carlos leaned closer, his next words barely audible. Now you know why I'm really here. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Mike felt his legs give way, and only Tommy Ricci's quick reflexes kept him from collapsing completely onto the cafeteria floor. Around them, 300 inmates watched in stunned silence as the legendary Iron Mike Tyson crumbled before their eyes. Easy, Mike, Tommy whispered, his arm supporting Mike's weight. Whatever this punk is selling, you don't have to buy it. But Mike barely heard him. The truth Carlos had spoken wasn't revelation. It was excavation, digging up memories Mike had buried so deep he'd convinced himself they belonged to someone else. The taste of tequila burning his throat before the sparring session. The way Diego had kept his hands low, defensive, apologetic. The sound of his own voice, slurred with alcohol and rage, screaming accusations that made no sense even then. Tell Carlos I'm sorry. Those words, whispered through blood and broken teeth, had haunted Mike's dreams for 20 years. But he'd twisted them in his memory, made them about the fight instead of about family, about failure instead of forgiveness. You need to sit down. Officer Rodriguez materialized beside them, his radio crackling with backup calls. But his eyes weren't on Mike, they were on Carlos, and in that glance Mike saw confirmation of everything the kid had claimed. Family loyalty, decades deep, and poison strong. I'm fine, Mike straightened, shrugging off Tommy's support. His voice carried across the silent cafeteria, but it sounded hollow, defeated. Just need some air. Carlos stepped back, satisfaction radiating from him like heat. There's more, Mike. So much more. 20 years is a long time to prepare for a conversation. That's enough, Rodriguez said sharply, but Carlos ignored him. Your daughter applied for a volunteer position here 6 months ago, Carlos continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. Victim advocacy program. Did you know that? She wanted to help prisoners' families deal with trauma. My cousin made sure her application got lost in the shuffle. Wouldn't want her finding out who really sleeps in cell block D, would we? Mike's world imploded. Exodus had tried to come here, tried to help families just like Carlos's, and she'd been blocked by the same corruption that had allowed Carlos to orchestrate this entire nightmare. Why? Mike's voice cracked like an adolescent's. Why wait 20 years? Why not just kill me and be done with it? Because death would be mercy, Carlos replied simply. And mercy is what you showed my brother. None. He paused, letting the words settle like sediment in still water. I want you to lose everything the way we did. Your peace, your family, your carefully constructed redemption story. I want you to remember what you really are. Tommy Ricci stepped forward, his hand moving toward the shiv Mike knew he carried. You want to settle this right here, kid? Because Iron Mike's got friends who remember when respect meant something. Stand down, Mike said quietly, putting a hand on Tommy's chest. The gesture sent ripples through the watching crowd. Even beaten, even broken, Iron Mike Tyson could still command loyalty from men who'd forgotten how to trust anything. Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think this is about prison politics? About gang territories and commissary debts? He reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph, this one more recent. Mike's breath caught as he recognized it. Exodus at her college graduation, her smile radiant as she held her social work degree. 15 years ago, Carlos said, right after she graduated. I was there, Mike, in the crowd, watching Diego's killer's daughter celebrate her bright future. Do you know what my mother said when I showed her this picture? She said Exodus had kind eyes. Said maybe some good could come from all the pain if that girl was trying to help families like ours. Mike's hands began to shake again, but this time with something deeper than fear. Don't you dare. I'm not going to hurt her, Carlos cut him off. I'm going to save her. From you. From the lies you've built her life on. From the monster she calls Daddy. The cafeteria erupted in whispers, the tension finally too much for hundreds of men to bear in silence. Rodriguez barked orders into his radio while other guards moved to establish a perimeter around the confrontation. But Mike heard none of it. All his focus had narrowed to Carlos's next words, to the final move in a game that had been 20 years in the making. Tomorrow morning you're going to call your daughter, Carlos said, his voice cutting through the chaos with surgical precision. And you're going to tell her the truth about Manila. Every detail, every lie, every drop of my brother's blood on your hands. Or I'll tell her myself. Carlos pocketed the photograph of Exodus and stepped back into the crowd of his gang members. You have until sunrise, Mike. Choose carefully. The point of no return had finally arrived. The cafeteria exploded into chaos as guards rushed in, but Mike stood frozen in the eye of the hurricane, Carlos's ultimatum echoing in his skull like a death knell. Around him, inmates scattered back to their tables under barked orders, but the damage was done. The truth hung in the air like cordite after a gunshot. Acrid, unmistakable, and impossible to take back. Mike walked mechanically toward the exit, his legs moving without conscious direction. Behind him, he could hear Rodriguez's radio crackling with incident reports, Carlos's laughter cutting through the static like broken glass. The sound followed Mike down the corridor, bouncing off concrete walls that suddenly felt more like a tomb than a prison. His cell offered no sanctuary. Diego's photograph still lay on his pillow, but now Mike saw it through Carlos's eyes, not just evidence of a crime, but a shrine to innocence destroyed. He picked up the image with trembling fingers, studying the 8-year-old boy who'd grown into his judge, jury, and executioner. 20 years of planning. The scope of Carlos's patience was breathtaking in its cruelty. While Mike had built his careful redemption story, therapy sessions, meditation, letters to Exodus filled with wisdom about overcoming mistakes, Carlos had been orchestrating this moment with surgical precision. Every transfer, every conversation, every blocked application from Exodus, all leading to this impossible choice. Tell his daughter the truth and watch her world collapse, or let Carlos poison her against him with 20 years of rage backing every word. Mike's hands began to shake so violently he nearly dropped the photograph. The memory Carlos had excavated was spreading through his consciousness like acid, dissolving the careful barriers he'd constructed around that night. He could smell the tequila on his breath again, feel the cocaine burning through his sinuses, hear his own voice slurring accusations at a kid who was just trying to do his job. Diego hadn't been challenging him. Diego had been helping him, following instructions from Mike's own team to provide light work before the Morrison fight, and Mike had beaten him to death for it. The sound that escaped Mike's throat was somewhere between a sob and a roar, 20 years of suppressed guilt finally breaking free. He pressed his back against the cell wall and slid to the floor, the photograph clutched against his chest like armor that offered no protection. Footsteps echoed in the corridor. Tommy Ricci appeared at the cell door, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mike? You okay in there?" No. The honesty surprised Mike. After decades of maintaining strength, of never showing weakness even to allies, the simple truth felt like stepping off a cliff. "I'm not okay, Tommy. Haven't been okay for 20 years. Tommy stepped into the cell, his presence filling the cramped space. "Whatever that punk thinks he knows about you, it doesn't matter in here. You're Iron Mike fucking Tyson. You've earned respect, you've earned protection. Say the word and Carlos Mendez disappears into the general population like smoke." Mike looked up at his friend, this career criminal who'd become the closest thing to family he had inside these walls, and felt something crack in his chest. What if he's right? What if everything I've told myself, everything I've told my daughter has been a lie? "Then you live with it," Tommy said simply, "like the rest of us live with our shit. You think I haven't done things that would make my kids sick if they knew? You think any of us are who we pretend to be in our letters home?" But that was exactly the problem. Micah had pretended to be someone else, not just in letters but in his own heart. He'd transformed his drunk, drug-fueled murder of an innocent kid into a tragic accident between fighters. He'd built an entire identity around redemption and growth, around being a better man than his past. Now Carlos was demanding he choose, destroy that identity himself, or watch it burn at the hands of someone who dedicated his life to justice. "He's going to call my daughter," Mike whispered. "If I don't tell her first, he'll tell her everything. And he won't make it sound like an accident." Tommy's expression darkened. "Rodriguez, his cousin, has been feeding him information for months. Son of a bitch." Tommy's hand moved instinctively toward where Mike knew he kept his shiv. "Corrupt guards are worse than rats. Want me to—" Mike struggled to his feet, using the wall for support. "This isn't about prison politics anymore. It's about truth. And the truth is—" He looked down at Diego's photograph, at the innocent face that would never age beyond 22. "The truth is, I killed that boy. Not in self-defense, not in a fair fight. I murdered him while he was trying to help me." The words hung between them like a confession to a priest who'd forgotten how to grant absolution. Tommy's face went carefully neutral, the expression of a man who'd heard too many admissions to judge any of them. "So what are you going to do?" Tommy asked quietly. Mike closed his eyes, feeling the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. When he opened them again, something fundamental had shifted. The careful control he'd maintained, the dignified facade he'd worn like armor, began to crack. "I'm going to call my daughter," Mike said, "and I'm going to tell her who I really am." The phone booth in the visitors' center felt like a confessional, its scratched plexiglass walls offering the illusion of privacy, while guards watched from their station 20 feet away. Mike's hands trembled as he dialed Exodus's number, each digit a step closer to destroying the most precious thing in his world. 3 rings. 4. On the 5th, her voice broke through the static, warm, concerned, utterly unaware that her father was about to shatter her universe. "Dad, you don't usually call this early. Is everything okay?" Mike closed his eyes, memorizing the sound of trust in her voice. After today, he'd never hear it again. "Baby girl, I need to tell you something. About Manila. About why I'm really here." The silence stretched between them like a chasm. When Exodus spoke again, her voice carried the careful tone of someone who'd counseled trauma victims, who understood that some truths came wrapped in razor wire. "What about Manila, Dad?" So Mike told her. Everything. The cocaine and tequila, Diego's gentle hands and apologetic smile, the sound of his own voice screaming accusations that made no sense. He told her about the blood, about Diego's last words, about the 20 years he'd spent lying to himself and everyone else about what really happened that night. He told her about Carlos, about Rodriguez's corruption, about the photograph of her graduation that had been carried for 15 years by a brother seeking justice. He watched his reflection in the plexiglass as he spoke, seeing his face age decades in minutes. Exodus didn't interrupt, didn't gasp or cry or hang up. She listened with the professional composure that had made her one of the most respected victim advocates in Chicago, even as her father confessed to being exactly the kind of monster she'd dedicated her career to stopping. When Mike finished, the silence felt like standing in a graveyard at midnight. "How old was he?" Exodus asked finally. 22. "Same age I was when I graduated." Her voice carried no emotion, but Mike could hear her breathing change. "All those letters you sent me, about redemption and growth and learning from mistakes, I believed them when I wrote them," Mike whispered. I'd convinced myself it was an accident, that we were sparring and something went wrong. I needed it to be an accident, Exodus. I needed to be someone you could love, but it wasn't an accident. No, it was murder." The word hung between them like a death sentence. Mike watched a guard glance at his watch, calculating how much time remained before his phone privileges ended. How long did it take to destroy a lifetime of love? "The Victim Advocacy Program," Exodus said suddenly. "I applied to volunteer at your facility 6 months ago. They told me my application was denied for security reasons. Carlos's cousin blocked it to protect their plan to make you tell the truth." Mike flinched at the word truth. All his life, truth had been something malleable, something he could shape to fit his needs. Champions didn't murder innocent kids during training sessions. They had tragic accidents with sparring partners who knew the risks. Loving fathers didn't destroy families with their rage. They made mistakes they learned from. But Diego Mendez had never been a sparring partner. He'd been a victim. And Mike had never been a champion learning from tragedy. He'd been a killer living a lie. "I understand if you never want to see me again," Mike said, the words scraping his throat raw. "If you want to change your name, pretend you never had a father. I understand if—" "Don't." Exodus's voice cut through his rambling like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me what I should feel or what I should do. You've taken 20 years of choices away from me by lying about who you are. Don't take away my right to decide what comes next." Mike pressed his forehead against the cool plexiglass, watching his breath fog the surface. In the reflection, he looked exactly like what he was, a broken old man who'd run out of masks to hide behind. "I love you, baby girl. That was never a lie." "I know." Exodus's voice cracked for the first time since he'd started talking. "And I love the father I thought I had. I need time to figure out if I can love the father you actually are." The line went dead, leaving Mike alone with the dial tone and the weight of absolute honesty. He hung up the phone and walked back through the prison corridors, past the stares of inmates who'd heard about the cafeteria confrontation, past Carlos's satisfied smile in the common area. In his cell, Diego's photograph still lay on his pillow, but now Mike saw it clearly, not as evidence of his guilt, but as a reminder of who deserved to be remembered. He placed the picture carefully on his small desk and sat down to write a letter he should have written 20 years ago. "Dear Mrs. Mendez, my name is Michael Tyson, and I killed your son.